The moment Diane Carter introduced me to her entire family as the help, I smiled. Not a small smile, a full one, the kind that takes practice. She was standing in the center of her sister's backyard holding a glass of sweet tea, surrounded by 43 members of the Carter family who had driven in from 4 different states for the annual reunion. She had her hand on my arm, gently, like we were close, and she said to no one in particular and everyone at once, "And this is Renata. She helps out around the house." I said nothing. I smiled, I nodded, I let the introduction land the way she intended it to land, and I watched it settle across the faces of 43 people who had just been told very clearly exactly where I stood in the Carter family hierarchy. And then I reached into my bag, because my phone was ringing. My name is Renata Simone O'Coffer by birth, which is the name I have always used professionally and the name that was on every contract, every deed, every filing at the Georgia Secretary of State's office for the company I had been building for the past 3 years. I am 37 years old, I have a master's degree in business administration from Emory University, I have been working in commercial real estate for 11 years, and for the past 14 months I had been the co-founder and managing partner of O'Coffer Park Commercial Real Estate, which by the time of the reunion had closed 11 significant deals, and was in final negotiations with a client whose portfolio was larger than either of us had touched in our combined careers. I want to tell you about the woman who introduced me as the help, and about the phone call that came while I was standing in that backyard, and about what happened 40 minutes later when the person on the other end of that call walked through the gate. But first, I need to tell you about Marcus, and about his mother, and about the 4 years I spent inside a family that had decided before they even met me exactly what kind of woman Marcus should have brought home. Marcus Carter was the man I had been with for 4 years and married for 2. He was the second of 3 children born to Diane and Gerald Carter of Macon, Georgia. His older sister lived in Charlotte and maintained the kind of careful distance that suggested she had learned something the hard way. His younger brother still lived in Macon and called their mother every day. Marcus himself had left at 22 for Atlanta and had spent the following decade building a life there that felt, when I met him, genuinely his own. That was what attracted me to him first, not his looks, though he was handsome, not his career, though he was successful. It was the sense that he had thought about who he was and arrived at some answers that satisfied him, that he had left something behind and built something new and knew the difference between the two. What I understood much later was that leaving a place and leaving a family are entirely different things. Marcus had left Macon, he had not left the Carters, and the Carters, as I would spend 4 years discovering, were not the kind of family that made leaving easy. I met Diane Carter 6 weeks into dating Marcus. He had told me about her beforehand, carefully, in the specific way people describe parents they love and find difficult. He said she was strong, he said she had opinions, he said she meant well. All 3 things were true, none of them were the whole picture. Diane Carter was a woman who had raised 3 children with the complete conviction that she knew what was best for all of them, and this knowledge did not expire when they became adults. She was warm in public in a way that was entirely genuine. She had a laugh that filled a room and a memory for personal details that made you feel seen. She remembered birthdays, she sent cards, she asked about your mother. And she also, in the quieter moments, communicated with remarkable precision exactly what she thought of the choices her children made. Not loudly, not cruelly, in the specific way that is harder to name and harder to defend against because it never quite rises to the level of something you can point to directly. The first time I cooked for the family, a Sunday dinner, 6 months in, at Marcus's parents' house, Diane rearranged the dishes I had brought before anyone sat down. She did it while I was in the bathroom. She said when I came out and noticed that she had just wanted to make sure everything was accessible. She said it with such genuine warmth that I stood there for a moment trying to decide whether I was being oversensitive. I was not being oversensitive, But I also understood in that moment what the next several years were going to look like, and I made a choice, which was to stay anyway, because Marcus was worth it, because I believed that, and because I had spent enough time around difficult families to know that you could love someone fully while also finding their family exhausting, and that these two things did not cancel each other out. Over the next 18 months, Diane established the terms of our relationship with the consistency of a woman who had been doing this for a long time. She called Marcus every evening at 7, and Marcus answered. She visited once a month, and then twice, and then more. She had opinions about our house, our neighborhood, our plans, and she expressed them with the specific confidence of someone who had never been seriously challenged on anything she believed. She never called me by a dismissive name, she never said anything openly unkind, she was always technically within the bounds of what could be described as civility, but there is a kind of treatment that lives just inside those bounds that is technically inoffensive and functionally devastating, and Diane Carter was a master of it. Marcus saw some of it, he apologized for some of it, he sat across from me at our kitchen table more than once and said he knew it was hard and he was sorry and he was going to talk to her. And then he would talk to her, or he would try to, and Diane would be so warm and so wounded at the suggestion that anything she had done was unwelcoming that Marcus would come back to the table a little more depleted and a little less certain, and the conversation would end without resolution. I stopped expecting resolution about a year in. I did not stop loving Marcus. I just stopped expecting the situation to be different than it was. The reunion was the last Saturday of June. Diane's sister Patricia hosted it every year at her property outside Macon, a large house with a covered porch and a pool and a backyard that had absorbed the Carter extended family every summer for decades. 43 people had come this year, 4 states, 3 generations. We arrived at noon. Marcus carried the food, I carried my bag. Diane met us at the gate with her public warmth, which was real and which I had learned to receive without assuming it meant anything had changed. For the first 2 hours, I was fine. More than fine, actually. Marcus's aunts were funny and warm. His cousins' children were at the age where they attached themselves to whoever seemed most interesting, and I apparently qualified. I ate Patricia's potato salad and told her it was the best I'd ever had, and she held my hands and said I was welcome in her home any time. Marcus was across the yard talking to his Uncle Raymond. I watched him laugh at something and felt, the way I sometimes did in moments like this, the specific tenderness of loving someone in their natural habitat. He was good here. He was himself here. Whatever the complications, this was real too. And then Diane appeared at my elbow. She came smoothly, the way she always moved, without announcement, as if she had always been there. She had with her Patricia's sister Margaret, and Margaret's daughter Keisha, who was in business school, and 2 women from Charlotte I hadn't met. Diane said, with the full warmth of a woman who believed what she was saying, "Margaret, have you met Renata yet? She helps out around the house for us." I felt it with the way you feel something that was aimed at you. I did not react. I had learned over 18 months that reacting was exactly what a moment like this was designed to produce, that the power of a remark like that lived precisely in the reaction it provoked, and that denying it that reaction was the only response that cost it anything. I smiled. I extended my hand to Margaret. I said it was lovely to meet her. I shook Keisha's hand. I nodded at the women from Charlotte. Margaret said, "How long have you been with the family?" I said, "About 4 years." Margaret looked at Diane. Diane looked at her sweet tea. The women from Charlotte looked at each other with the particular expression of people who had just witnessed something they are not sure they understood correctly. I excused myself a moment later. I walked to the far edge of the yard where the magnolia trees gave shade, and the noise of the party became background. And I stood there for a moment, and I breathed. And I thought about what had just happened, and what, if anything, I was going to do about it. My phone rang. David Park. David Park was my business partner. We had met at Emory 8 years earlier, in a finance elective neither of us had wanted to take, and had ended up sitting next to each other because it was the only seats left. We had stayed friends through our respective careers, his in investment banking, mine in commercial real estate, and 14 months ago we had sat across from each other in a coffee shop in Buckhead and decided to build something together. Okafor Park Commercial Real Estate had, in 14 months, exceeded every projection we had set in that coffee shop by a margin that still surprised us both when we looked at the numbers. We had closed 11 deals, we had 4 employees, we had been featured in Atlanta Business Chronicle, and had been approached by 2 larger firms about acquisition conversations that we had declined because we were not interested in being acquired. And we were, at that moment, in final negotiations with the Henderson Group. The Henderson Group was the most significant Black-owned commercial real estate investment firm in the southeastern United States. They had been on our target client list since before we launched. Getting a meeting with them had taken 8 months of relationship building and 3 separate introductions through mutual contacts. The meeting we had finally gotten was scheduled for the following Monday morning. David said, "The Hendersons are in Macon." I said, "What?" He said, "James Henderson and his daughter. They're here for a family thing, turns out. I just found out from the Charlotte connection. They want to meet today if possible. I know you're at the reunion, but Renata, it's the Hendersons." I stood under the magnolia tree and looked across the yard at 43 members of the Carter family in various states of conversation and laughter and potato salad consumption. I said, "Send me the address," and David, "Come here first." He said, "Come to the reunion?" I said, "Yes, I'll explain when you get here." I hung up. I stood there another moment, and then I walked back into the yard and I found Marcus, and I said quietly, close enough that only he could hear, "Your mother just introduced me to your family as the help." Marcus went still in the specific way he went still when something landed that he had been afraid was coming. He closed his eyes for a moment, just one, then opened them. He said, "Renata." I said, "I'm not asking you to do anything right now. I'm telling you what happened. My business partner is coming." He said, "Here? Why?" I said, "Because I asked him to." David Park arrived 45 minutes later. He came through the gate in the suit he had been wearing to a morning meeting, dark navy, well-fitted, the kind of suit that makes its own statement without trying to. He was also, incidentally, a man whose photograph had appeared on the cover of Atlanta Business Chronicle's 40 Under 40 issue, a man who had been profiled in Forbes, in Black Enterprise, in a piece in the Wall Street Journal about the new generation of Black commercial real estate developers, a man whose name, in certain rooms in Atlanta and beyond, opened doors before he reached them. None of that was why I had asked him to come. I had asked him to come because David was my partner and he was my friend, and I had just been introduced as the help to 43 people, and I needed someone in that yard who knew exactly who I was. Diane saw him come through the gate. She was across the yard, but Diane Carter missed very little, and she moved towards us with the specific purposefulness of a woman who intends to be the one who makes the introduction. She said, "And who is this?" David said, "David Park, Okafor Park Commercial Real Estate." He shook her hand. "You must be Marcus's mother. Renata talks about the family often." Diane said, "Okafor Park?" David said, "Yes, ma'am, Renata's firm. I'm her partner." He looked around the yard with genuine appreciation. "Beautiful property. This yours?" Diane said, "My sister's." David said, "Lovely. We have a client, actually, looking at commercial land in this county. Renata, remind me to pull those comps when we're back." I said, "I'll put it on the calendar." I watched Diane Carter's face in the silence that followed. I watched something move across it. Not embarrassment exactly, though that was part of it. Something more fundamental. the expression of a woman who has built an architecture of assumptions and has just discovered that one of the load-bearing walls was wrong. The cousins from Charlotte were nearby. Margaret was nearby. Keisha was nearby. The introduction from 45 minutes earlier was still in the air between all of them, unretracted, unaddressed. I did not address it. I turned to David and said, "Come meet Marcus." What happened after that was quieter than a confrontation and more lasting than a scene. The Carters were not a family that made scenes at reunions. Diane especially was too controlled for that. What happened instead was a slow, wordless reorganization. The cousins from Charlotte found reasons to come introduce themselves to me. Margaret asked questions about the firm with genuine curiosity. Keisha, who was finishing her MBA, asked if we ever took interns. 3 of Marcus's aunts, who had been perfectly pleasant before, were suddenly more interested in the conversation I was part of. Diane stayed at the far end of the yard for most of the afternoon. I saw her once in conversation with Gerald, speaking quietly, and Gerald glanced at me once and looked away. I did not look away when he did. I held the look until he did. David and I left the reunion at 4 o'clock and drove across Macon to meet James Henderson and his daughter at a restaurant near their hotel. The meeting lasted 2 hours. James Henderson was 71 years old, had been building his firm for 40 years, and had the specific quality of attention that belongs to people who have spent decades listening carefully and been rewarded for it. His daughter was 34, and sharp in a way that made David and me both sharper just by being in the room with her. The Henderson Group became our client 6 weeks later. The contract we signed with them was the largest in our firm's short history, and we were both fairly certain the beginning of a relationship that would define the next decade of what we were building. Marcus and I separated 8 months after the reunion, not because of what Diane said in that backyard. That was a moment in a longer story, not the story itself. The story was about a man who loved me genuinely and who could not, when it mattered most, choose me clearly enough and consistently enough for the choice to hold. I do not tell this to wound him. I tell it because it is true, and because the truth of it is what eventually set both of us free to be somewhere we actually belonged. I think about the reunion sometimes, about the magnolia trees and the potato salad and Patricia's warmth and the way 43 people quietly reorganized their understanding of me over the course of an afternoon without anyone saying anything directly, about the way David walked through that gate and simply was who he was, which turned out to be sufficient. I think about Diane sometimes too, about what it must have felt like to stand in that yard and watch the introduction she had made reconstruct itself in real time. I don't think about it with anger anymore. I think about it the way you think about something that cost you something, and also eventually gave you something. The clarity of it, the absolute clarity of finally seeing, without any remaining ambiguity, what a situation actually was. What I know now is this: you cannot control how someone introduces you. You cannot control the story someone tells about you to their family in a backyard in Macon. You cannot make someone see you clearly if they have decided not to look. What you can control is who you actually are, and who you actually are has a way of walking through the gate eventually, without being asked, without announcing itself, in a suit with a leather folder and a name that opens doors. You just have to be patient enough to be standing there when it arrives. I want to say something to anyone listening who has been placed by someone who should have known better in a category that doesn't fit, who has been introduced as less than what they are, who has smiled through something that was meant to diminish them and felt the specific loneliness of being the only person in the room who fully understood what had just happened. Smile. shake the hand, walk to the edge of the yard, answer your phone. The truth about who you are is not something anyone else gets to decide. Not a mother-in-law at a family reunion, not a family that made up its mind about you before you arrived. Not anyone who has confused their opinion of you with a fact about you. The truth walks through the gate on its own schedule. Your job is simply to be there, to keep building, to keep being exactly who you are, fully and without apology, until the evidence becomes impossible to ignore. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to Zuri Chronicles, because every week we come back here and tell another story, another truth, another woman who let who she actually was speak louder than anything anyone said about her. My name is Zuri, and I'll see you next time.